Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the new Big Five, presented by Matt Meyer. Matt has been guiding trips across Africa for NatHab since 2017. And to save on Matt's bandwidth today, we'll be turning off his webcam until the Q&A. Thanks for being with us today, Matt. I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thanks, Kendall. Hi, everyone. Good evening from South Africa, and good day to those of you in the United States. So today we've got a really cool and exciting new initiative called the Big Five, or the new Big Five project. As you can see, there's some very recognizable names of animals, species from around the world that we're all very familiar with. But just a little bit of a background. This is me. This is after a hike in Madagascar, looking for some lemurs. And lemurs are on the list, on the new Big Five project list. So let's dive right in. So originally, this is what everyone knows as the Big Five. So you've got elephant, lion, buffalo, black rhino, and leopard. Now, the original Big Five was first coined that term as the 5 most difficult animals in Africa to hunt. Sort of turn of the century, the hunters that came across from Europe and from the Americas would come to Africa, and these were their sought-after trophies. But then it kind of evolved into something a little bit more on the ecotourism side. And now this is the sort of the photographic animals that everyone comes out to see, among others, in the African savanna. So the black rhino, the original member of the Big Five, it wasn't actually the white rhino, and then obviously the other animals don't need too much of an introduction. However, this project is now to highlight other animals, some of the smaller animals around the world, and some of the other larger, more iconic animals that aren't necessarily in the highlights that is needed for their conservation these days. So here we're looking at a map of the world showing where various countries are holding their sort of critically endangered numbers. You can see there that North America is pretty high up on that list of over 200 vulnerable species. Now, these are not just mammals, these are also birds, and you can see there's an eel there in Europe, there's a hula painted frog in the Middle East, and a bamboo lemur in Madagascar, Sumatran elephants in Sumatra, the forest owlet in India. And this kind of gives you a basic idea of where our threatened species are worldwide. Now, let's just move on to the mammals, because the new Big Five project is focusing mainly on larger mammals, sort of your keystone species in various environments. Now, keystone species is a species of animal that is crucial to the fundamentals of an environment. So if you were to remove that animal out of that environment, it would then slowly start to collapse. A very good example of a keystone species are the wolves of Yellowstone. We all saw what happened when they were removed, and how now that ecosystem has been allowed to be restored since their reintroduction some 20, 25, 30 odd years ago, and how everything else has been able to get back into its balance just by adding one species that we thought originally was vermin. So you can see from the key on the side there, just in terms of the breakdown, very similar to the last map, showing where we have very vulnerable species and their numbers. Now we'll move on, sort of go through the different regions, which will show us then which species are highlighted in the new Big Five project. So we're going to take a look at the Americas and sort of North and South America, as well as Central America, and then North America. I've kind of allowed to expand over to the polar regions. And as we all know, one of the most revered animals that is currently in the spotlight for global conservation is the polar bear. So we're looking at that over there. They are probably one of the higher runner-ups to get into the new Big Five. But if you just take a look here at these maps once again, you can just see by country the number of animals that are, or the number of species that are endangered currently, and their status. And obviously different regions are for the reason for the animals being vulnerable are for different reasons. In South America, severe logging to give way for agricultural land. In the very northern reaches of North America, it's obviously global warming that is affecting the winter months, the ability for the polar ice caps to recover after the summer. And then in Central America, it's also, you've got these islands and these areas that are just being pummeled every single year by these massive weather systems that are moving through, that typically would have only ever happened every 50 to 100 years. They're now happening every 5 to 10 years. And so some of these areas just aren't being given a chance to recover. And that is decimating those areas. And then obviously worldwide, it's human encroachment, increased agricultural areas and reasons alike. So the polar bear, that's an animal that doesn't need much of an introduction. Their numbers are very duly affected, obviously, by climate change. And they are our first species that we're looking at coming in from the very northern polar region. But then as we move further south, we've got the grizzlies up there on the top left. That photo was by one of our expedition leaders, Brad Josephs. Then our weird and wacky little armadillo there, down to the moose, and then the wolves, as I mentioned, being that keystone species that shows us how environments shift and change as we can remove or add in species. Then shifting a little bit further down into South America, the tapir and the jaguar, and then the three-toed sloth, and then going all the way down into Patagonia with the puma there. Now, these animals, obviously, they are the larger, more iconic ones. They're not necessarily the small little critters that people don't really recognize too much in these environments. But again, we go back to that keystone species, and that's one of this sort of is a big focus on this, is that by saving one or two of these species, it enables us to save an entire ecosystem. So by focusing on a jaguar, you're then able to bring and shed light into the conservation of the Pantanal. And we can go back time and time again to the wolves of Yellowstone. You conserve that one species, you then conserve Yellowstone. So from there, we move east to Africa. You can see down at the bottom there, South Africa, obviously my home. We're in a vulnerable state at the moment. I mean, worldwide, we're in a vulnerable state with conservation, in that tourism has been pretty much stopped altogether. So a lot of these areas that rely completely on tourism for conservation are suffering. Across Africa, your average country is sitting between sort of 20 and 40 endangered species in areas that are not almost entirely desert, like you've got Namibia, Angola, and then Sudan, Chad, Libya, Algeria, up in sort of North Africa. Those are almost entirely desert, so they've got a very shallow diversity in terms of these large mammals that we're looking at for number of endangered species. But then look a little bit to the right-hand side, you've got Madagascar there, which you're doing 114 endangered mammals. Madagascar is home to just over 100 lemur species. They've got almost half a dozen tenrec species, a tenrec's like a little hedgehog across a shrew, which are related to neither of them. It's home to some really, really odd creatures. I did a webinar earlier on in the year just on Madagascar, and the biodiversity there is phenomenal. It's off the charts, one of the highest levels of endemism than anywhere else in the world. But because of human conflict, also one of the highest number of endangered species in the world. And right now, I mean, I've got a friend in Madagascar who I chat to on a regular basis, and with there not being any travel to Madagascar, they're in a bad state at the moment with their conservation because they do rely so much on that. So this project will highlight areas like that and species like that, and lemur being, lemurs as a group being added to this list of the new Big Five project. So just to highlight a few of the species that we'll be looking at in Africa that are on the new Big Five. You've got the ground pangolin up in the top left-hand corner there. These guys are, they're like a soccer ball with a porcupine, pineapple kind of. They really are bizarre creatures, like the North American armadillo. Whenever they get stressed out, they just roll up in a ball. Those scales act as their defense mechanisms. I've seen lions trying to bite through that, but to no avail. And they are termite eaters. So they walk around like that on their two back legs, and their front legs are, they've got these giant claws that they use for digging, and then their tongue is sort of 5 or 6 times the length of their head. That is the single most trafficked animal in the world. They are threatened as a direct cause of human trafficking. So there are about 6 or 7 species, or about 4 or 5 species in Africa, and about 5 or 6 species in Asia and Southeast Asia. Some climb trees, some are ground dwelling like this one, but for all intents and purposes, they are small invertebrate foragers. So they're also affected by climate. This photo is taken of one in the Kalahari Desert. As climate shifts and the daytime is the sort of your daylight hours, they're more extreme temperatures, ranging from really, really hot days to cool to even cold night times. Termites are only active for a very short window, and all they do is then increase their colony size. But the pangolins still have to forage for a certain number of hours. They can only eat at a certain pace, and so if they can't forage for long enough, then they can't eat enough, and so that's another effect of theirs. Then over to the right of that, you've got the giraffe, several species of giraffe across the African continent, and this is an animal that is quite literally disappearing before our eyes. It's something that we would think they're always going to be giraffe. That's Africa's animal. That's arguably the iconic animal in Africa, and it is now one of the most threatened, and that is also through direct human conflict. They're poached for bushmeat, but then also their habitats are being lost, so human encroachment into their natural habitats. The chimpanzee is another addition to the list, like the gorilla as well, another one of the great apes. They are, their plight is also due to direct human conflict, traded for bushmeat, and then also they're fairly susceptible to several human pathogens. So if we were to get the flu and you can go and trek with a chimpanzee, they are directly affected by that. And so theirs is also a direct as well as an indirect cause for their decline. And then in the bottom right, we've got the cheetah, the fastest land mammal in the world. Now we're sitting at less than 7,500 of them left across the entire continent. And that's only in a few countries. And theirs is direct human conflict. They are quite avid goat and sheep hunters in certain parts, and so they're often poisoned or chased out of areas for killing livestock. Then we've got some of the unsung heroes. So the meerkats, the African wild dog, which some of you might have recognized that photo from one of my webinars a few weeks ago. Then the bottom left, we've got a caracal, which is Africa's equivalent of something like a lynx. And then the face that only a mother could love, the warthog, wallowing there in its mud wallow. Now, with the exception of the wild dog, all of these animals here might not be very high up on the threatened or endangered species, but they are iconic in their areas. And so that is another one of the reasons why this project was created by Graeme Green, was to highlight some of the animals that are deserved of being in something like a new Big Five project, not just these big lions and elephants and a rhino, but some of the smaller, quirkier animals that we all enjoy spending time with. And then obviously there wouldn't be a list in Africa that isn't complete without the wildebeest and the zebra, and then below them there the hippo, which, funnily enough, in terms of the origin, where the Big Five originated from, hippos actually are responsible for more human fatalities in Africa than any other animal, with the exception of the mosquito through malaria. So hippos kill more people than any of the other Big Five, but they were never put on that list because it wasn't really something that was a sought after animal. But they do make this list, and also not necessarily just for their size and grandeur, but their quirkiness as well. They can be quite fun animals to watch. So moving from Africa, we'll move a little bit north, and then we'll continue going east. So Europe and the Middle East, and Asia. So you can see there those two animals, the bat and the otter. It's a Eurasian otter, and it's one of the insectivorous bats of Europe. And the bats, their main, so insectivorous bats are obviously nocturnal, and their food source are insects that fly around at night. The little sort of microplankton insects, your nose-peons and mosquitoes and fruit flies and things, that is their prey. And obviously a lot of those animals, a lot of those insects are not favorable for agriculture. And so with the increased use of pesticides, it's a ripple down effect to the bats, and then that will then ripple down to owls, and so on and so forth down the food chain. And so bats feature, although found worldwide, feature high up on the European list purely from agriculture having taken over a lot of their native land, and a huge increase in pesticides has reduced their food source. And then otters, that's direct pet trade as well as pelt trading for their skins and whatnot. But then moving across into Asia, we've got a lot of success stories. So the panda, obviously our partners at the WWF, that is their icon as being one of the great success stories for conservation worldwide. Then above them there, the little red panda, and then the Asian otter also features here on this list. So moving a little bit south from sort of northern and central Asia down into Nepal and India, we've got the snow leopard there, from Hemis National Park up in northwest India and over into Pakistan. And then the greater one-horned rhino, obviously the tiger, another animal that needs no real introduction, and then your Eurasian lynx, all worthy of being on this list and for their own reasons. Then down into sort of Southeast Asia and Australia, is your Indonesia being an epicenter for your endangered mammals, much like Madagascar and sort of Central South America. And that is, again, another direct human-animal conflict with the removal of a lot of their ecosystem. The looser ecosystem being one of the most well-known ecosystems that's being degraded and removed for the production of palm oil and other agriculture as well. And then that Southeast Asia and down into Australia, that obviously includes some of our animals like your koala and your kangaroo, which probably the antithesis of the original Big Five, the complete opposite. They look to be the most harmless, cute, cuddly, fluffy, fuzzy creatures that didn't look like they could do much more than scare you to death with their cuteness. But they are also animals that are extremely threatened now. I mean, with those fires that went through Australia towards the end of last year and into the beginning of this year, millions upon millions of hectares, tens of millions of acres of native forest lost in eastern Australia, where we lost, I don't even know the numbers of koalas, and their habitat was lost just to those fires alone. And that's one sort of environmental act that happened that has reduced those species numbers, and that's directly linked to obviously the global issue of global warming. And then into sort of Indonesia, you've got your Komodo dragon, your orangutan, and the Sumatran rhino, sorry, the Javan rhino, and the slow loris. Now, the slow loris is very similar, and well, not similar, but closest relation, Asian relation to the lemur, and then your orangutan, one of your great apes as well. And then the rhino was on the list, but as a sort of a broad general rhino, doesn't encompass either of or any of the 5 remaining species worldwide, but more just the highlights of the rhino as a group in general. So I'm just going to go over the entire list of what we have on the new Big Five, project. So we have, and some of them are, I mean, the original Big Five are on it. That doesn't mean that, and this is something that I'm going to encourage everyone to go home or at home to vote on this, because this is something that it'll be fun to see if your animals came up in a few months' time, and then you're shedding light essentially on species that need all the help they can get. So we've got the elephants, the lion, the gorilla, the tiger, snow leopard, pangolin, orangutan, wolf, panda, koala, rhino, giraffe, leopard, chimpanzee, lemur, fox, monkey, cheetah, sloth, grizzly bear, hippo, wild dog, meerkat, wildebeest, jaguar, kangaroo, tapir, warthog, slow loris, hyena, zebra, Komodo dragon, deer, lynx, tortoise, crocodile, moose, otter, capybara, puma, bat, red panda, armadillo, caracal, and alligator. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there aren't many of the sort of smaller creatures that feature too much on this list, for the simple reason of how photogenic animals are. And it was also, there were about 100 or so photographers worldwide that were involved in this, and they were asked to come up with this list between them, and they got to those 45 odd species with the intended purpose of having iconic species in different areas as mascots or as ambassadors for that environment, to bring people to that environment to then act as the photographic keystone species of, let's say here, the looser ecosystem with a rhino and an orangutan. You go there to see them, and you save anything down to the birds and the rodents of that ecosystem. But basically, yeah, the new Big Five project is an international initiative to create a new Big Five of wildlife, for wildlife photography, not for hunting, shooting with a camera and not a gun. It's supported by Dr. Jane Goodall. It has ambassadors from around the world, not just conservationists, but actors, activists, photographers, and each of them was able to choose to showcase an animal that they essentially wanted to have highlight an area that needed as much help as it could get. And then now, obviously, with COVID and everything being shut down almost worldwide, this is a time when these animals need us more. And that's why something like a project like this, with these webinars like this, it allows us to still retain a bit of touch with this, with these ongoing issues and with these ongoing conservation initiatives, to allow these animals to survive going on into the future. There are, there's some of the world's most iconic creatures that have been highlighted in here. And then if you look at the next slide, you can see these are the five that I've chosen as mine. And obviously, coming from South Africa, from Africa, I have a bias towards the African animals, but it is also, it's these are animals that I've, with the exception of the polar bear, which I'm hoping I'll get to see in the near future. These are animals that I've been involved with and seen on the ground myself. That pangolin was, I took that photograph of, we were following a crowd of lions that were hunting one night when I was still working at Mala Game Reserve near the Kruger Park, and they came across this pangolin and they pawed at it for a while, and a few of the cubs tried to chew on a scale here and there, and after about 10 or 15 minutes they got bored and the lions moved off, and there were 2 or 3 of us safari guides there, and the guests were absolutely astonished that we wouldn't want to carry on following the lions, that we just want to sit there and look at this weird basketball with scales on it, and it kind of looks like a pine cone. But this is just one of the most fascinating creatures in Africa, and for any safari guide and any seasoned guest will know that this is the unicorn on a safari. If you get to see a pangolin, that's bragging rights forever. And then the giraffes, they're kind of as I mentioned earlier, they're an animal that we always think they'll be there forever, but they've been disappearing right before our eyes, and there's several documentaries, the last of the long necks being one of them, that showcases and allows us to get an insight into what is actually happening with giraffe and the conservation efforts that are going into moving them around from reserves, because for them it's not these giraffes aren't shot for a trophy and taken across the world, and they're not traded internationally for parts and things like rhinos or elephants or tigers or lions. This animal is poached for meat for the survival of people that live on the periphery of these great game reserves. And so it's something that should be an easy fix. It should be, okay, let's empower these local communities to not have a need or to not be reliant on what's inside the reserve. And the only way of doing that is to conserve those communities and to help those communities. So rather than having a game reserve offense a community, that community needs to see value in that land beyond their next meal, beyond what they can sell that pound of meat to their neighbors so they can then buy rice. And same goes for a lot of other African animals that aren't on anyone's list to come to Africa to see. Some of your plains game, some just your again, the unsung heroes of these ecosystems. Those are the ones that are not necessarily taken worldwide, but that they're needed by local communities, and so those communities need to see a value in them. And the gorilla is one of those success stories where there was this small little pocketed population of mountain gorillas that were left in Rwanda and Uganda, and through efforts from the WWF, through the Diane Fossey Foundation, through all of those, tourism has been built up to the point now where these communities benefit from the park entrance fees to go and see the gorillas. You go there to go for your gorilla trek, and there'll be 15 porters waiting for the group of 8 tourists to go up the mountain. And each one of those porters, just the daily rate and the tip that you give them, that puts food on the table for a few weeks. And for you, it's 10 or 15, maybe $20. For them, that's a decent wage for a couple of days, and it's for one day's work. And so they're seeing the value in these animals that goes far beyond going into the park, killing a gorilla, coming out and selling its hands or its head for ornamental things or for bushmeat. That might give you a couple of dozen, maybe $100 or $200 right now, but then in a month's time, you've got nothing. But if it's this consistent, continual value that these communities are seeing, then they'll look to support them and to protect them. And that's what's kind of happening in Madagascar. So if the bottom left there is the common brown lemur. It's not the most photogenic, it's not the prettiest, but they're my favorite. They make these little grunting pig noises, so they've been nicknamed the pig lemur by the locals. And they're one of 100 odd, 107, 108 odd species of lemur that remain. And they're one of the least endangered, but there isn't a single species of lemur on the entire island of Madagascar that is not endangered. Now that's something that it took a while for me to let it sink in when I first went there a few years ago. In the African savanna, we have everything is threatened, everything is vulnerable, but not everything is endangered or critically endangered. We've got animals that they're tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. But to go to Madagascar and to look, and every single species of lemur is endangered or critically endangered or on the brink of extinction. There are some that are isolated to maybe a few hundred acres of a forest, and that's their entire geographic range, where when that forest disappears, that species will too. And that's a species that needs to be highlighted because it is an ambassador for its entire island of Madagascar. And that is through direct habitat loss. So it's not through poaching for meat or poaching for a trophy or for the pet trade predominantly. That is just direct habitat loss. Much like, and this will be the last animal the first and the last animal that I will present this evening or today is the polar bear. They are on the, for lack of a better choice of words, and excuse the pun, on the literal tip of the iceberg of what all of these species that we have spoken about tonight and what this project hopes to highlight is our effect on the environment that we live in and how what we do at home affects things on a global scale. And the polar bears are a species that everyone's been on everyone's sort of watch list for the last few decades, and seeing how their habitat is now shrinking based on what we have done over the last 100 or so years, and how we are rapidly speeding that process up. And this is a species that, again, it's that they are the sort of, the top thing, the top animal out of all of these lists for us to look at and to say, this is where we need to start. This is how we need to save it. And they could essentially be the keystone species of the world, because if we can change things in our daily lives and the way we do things to then be able to shift things globally, we would then be able to, if we can save an animal like the polar bear, we can then save all of these other animals in their own turn. The mountain gorilla, the giraffe, the lemur, the pangolin, all the way down to the lorises and the wolves and foxes and deers and otters and bears. And so, yes, this is a globe, rather than that very first picture of all of the reds and the yellows of number of endangered species in different regions and percentages of potential animals that we could lose. Let's try and have maybe this to be the next map when someone else presents something in 10 years' time to say, these were the animals that we were able to save while we were all focused on these environmental programs. And so a big thanks to everyone for coming tonight, and thanks. So you can go and vote now, and you can choose one of those animals or one of the other animals that was on that list. And then I'm going to hand over to Kendall if we've got some questions this evening.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. Before we get started with the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions for Matt via the questions field in your control panel. Okay, first question is, people want to know more about the next steps of this project, and there's been a lot of curiosity about why only choose 5 more, why not 10 more, and how will being named as part of this new Big 5 help or potentially hurt prospects?
So, great question. I would say the reason why they chose to stick with 5 was to kind of be to try and flip the mindset on why the original 5 were then created. So the original 5 being created through exploitation of an animal, this new Big 5 being created to help the animals. And then, so that's probably part of the reason why they stuck with the 5. But then in terms of the next step, this was I think what Graeme was, and all of the photographers that he was able to get in on this, and the ambassadors, was to hope that this is a catalyst for the next step, that we are at our tipping point now, where within the next 10 years, we're looking at flora and fauna worldwide. We're looking at about 1 million species of anything that you can imagine, that in the next 10 years, where it's their make or break. And so I think that that's what this was Graham's hope, was that this would catalyze a little bit more of a movement towards the conservation of these animals, and using them to highlight their sort of conservation success stories. I mean, if you have a look at this here, you've got the wolves, as I mentioned, the ones in Yellowstone, and in North America, wolves are yes, they are still persecuted, but they have done well in the last 20 or 30 years. Tigers have been on the rise for the last 4 or 5 years pretty well. Pandas, the global success story, and one of our partners' namesake, essentially, because of the great success they've had. And all of these would have been started in some way by something similar to this, to have something catalyze a reaction that would then ripple onto the greater conservation of these environments.
Great. And what are your top 3 criteria for the new Big 5?
My personal ones?
Uh-huh.
Well, so as I've never seen polar bears in the wild. So that was kind of that was my sort of wild card out of those 5. But just animals that people, with the giraffe, it was something that you never in your wildest dreams did you think that giraffe could be endangered or disappearing. And so it was to highlight the fact that they are threatened, the fact that they are going somewhere. Gorillas, the time that I've spent with them has been some of the best of my wildlife viewing. And so it was just, I think that anyone that can ever go on any nature-based trip, if you have the ability to go and see gorillas in the wild, that is probably will be a highlight. Pangolins, because of their global footprint and how they are, if you were to say to a person on the street, what's the most trafficked animal in the world, most of them would probably say an elephant, a tiger, etc., etc. No one thinks it's this scaly ant-eating creature that there are several species in Africa and in Europe, and they're trafficked worldwide. So for them, it was they are a spokesperson for the small weird creatures that no one really thinks about very often. And then lemurs, they're just the quirkiest, coolest, most comical little creatures that really do need a shout out when it comes to conservation. And so, barring the polar bear, those are all of the animals that I chose were animals that I have first-hand experience spending time with them in their natural environments, and I know and I have seen firsthand that their environments do need the help of a project like this. And those were my personal choices. I think secretly it's my hope that we could have a new big five that would have a species from each of the 5 zones that we spoke about, that would then highlight a global big five rather than just an African big five, and for conservation and photography rather than for exploitation.
Great. We had a lot of interest in why Madagascar has such a high number of endangered species. Can you fill us in a little bit more?
So sure, and that's another great question, and one that we highlighted a few months ago when we did the Madagascar webinar. But because it's a closed environment and a closed ecosystem, their level of specialization is significantly higher than any animal in Africa and in Asia. And it's typical of an island environment where as soon as you start to, if you think of an island being like that, and you've got all these different ecosystems, you remove this one, you remove everything in that one, because the lemur here, it might look very similar, but it's very different to the lemur here in this ecosystem. And since humans arrived in Madagascar, up until about 5 years ago, we thought it was 2,500 to 4,000 years ago, but recently it's now been thought that humans have been there a bit longer, sort of 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. We've gone and we've lost just over 96% of the natural habitat that was once in Madagascar. So there's only about between 3.4 and 3.6% remaining of what was the sort of natural native forest, whether it be dry deciduous or montane rainforest or mangroves. And so just their amounts of habitat loss sort of added onto their high level of speciation and diversity across the island has then compounded their effects on the number of endangered species. So when you've got such a negatively impacted area, everything is endangered, as opposed to a big continent like Africa where animals can move, and also animals aren't as, I'm not saying that they're not as evolved, but they're not as specialized as in Madagascar, just in terms of the number of species. So all of those factors compiled into the one factor now that they are, a lot of them are critically endangered.
Okay. We have a question about keystone species. Are they always at the top of the food chain, the larger animals?
Not necessarily. So they're not always the top of the food chain, and they're not always the biggest, but typically they're the ones that sort of control the movements of things below or above them in an ecosystem. An example that I often like to use from South Africa with the ongoing debate of rhino and looking after rhinos, in that there's the thought that if you were to take all of the rhinos out of one reserve, let's say the Kruger National Park, and put them in a very small reserve where you can protect them and you can look after them, you put fence around them, an anti-poaching unit, but then all of the animals that rely on them in the Kruger National Park, from your oxpeckers to your dung beetles to the other grazers that need those rhino to remove a lot of the moribund material, the grass material, those will suffer. And so they're not always the top of the food chain in terms of a predator, but they're not always the biggest. But typically, they are your species that have the most pull in an ecosystem. And yeah, we can go back to that example of the wolves in Yellowstone. That is the quintessential apex predator of that region, and without them, that entire ecosystem collapsed. Was on the way to collapsing, and then introduce a wolf, and then everything slowly starts to find its balance again, down to your elk numbers, allowing then the spruce to grow, etc., etc. So back to the question, I wouldn't say that they're always the big and apex animals, but typically, yes, they are the ones that have the most influence on an ecosystem.
Okay. Is it possible that the lack of travel and ecotourism is actually hurting the environment and conservation?
In terms of emissions and things like that, it's doing wonders for it. I mean, there are areas in India that they haven't seen the Himalayas for 30 or 40 years, that now they can see them, and we've got clear oceans and clear waters and that. But when it comes to third world countries, when it comes to a lot of, let's say, South America, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, where the people that live on the outsides, or the people that are typically supporting these reserves and these ecosystems, they rely entirely on tourism. And when there's no other option, there's no other way for them to earn an income, then yes, this is to the detriment of those environments. But in terms of the global standpoint of our oceans are recovering, the air quality is recovering, yes, the shutting down of countries has definitely been a positive help to that. But to the actual reserves and parks worldwide, certainly in third world countries, no, this has been a very tough time for conservation authorities to still try and look after their natural areas, but at the same time, people have got to eat, communities have got to survive, and without those tourists coming, it's very hard to do that.
Okay, great. And for those watching, if they want to check out online the new Big Five, where can they go?
So the actual website it's on the bottom of, I'm going to go all the way back to the very beginning. Just excuse the flashing back there. You can go to www.newbig5.com. And then on the top, on your info bar, you'll see there where it says vote. And if you want to get a list of the Big Five, the new Big Five, write it down before you vote, because once you voted, you'll never be able to see that again on that device. I learned that the hard way by having to ask several people, several friends, can you screenshot it? Yeah, I need a list. I need the list for this webinar that I'm presenting. And so once you voted, your votes are in, and that's to stop people from voting multiple times for different animals. So they're trying to encourage people to look at the list choose only 5, vote for those 5, and then I think they were hoping to have the new Big 5 announced fairly soon, but I think with COVID, they've extended it towards the later half or the later part of the year. So there is still a bit of time left.
Okay, great. Well, it's getting close to the top of the hour, Matt, so I'd like to hand things back over to you for some closing comments.
Yes, so thank you. And yeah, thanks to everyone for participating tonight and for coming along, or today. This is I think it's a really great project that anyone interested in conservation or travel or nature or photography should get involved in. It's meant to be a fun highlight to try and highlight some of these creatures that we've seen and we all want to see some more of. And as I mentioned, to try and be a catalyst to help us get over that next hurdle of trying to conserve so many of these animals that are on the brink within the next 10 or 20 years or so. So if this is a project that'll help that, then yeah, it's got my support. It's got support of some of the biggest names in conservation and environmental activism worldwide. And so if we can get as many more behind it as possible, that would be awesome. So yeah, from me, thank you very much to NatHab and to the WWF for all the conservation efforts they do, and I can't wait to be able to get back on expedition and lead trips in some of these amazing places. And I'm sure all of my fellow expedition leaders are just as eager to get back out there and see some of these animals again. And who knows, the next time we get out there, maybe one of the animals that we see on a more regular basis will be named in this new Big 5. So thanks, NatHab, and thanks, Kendall.
Thanks, Matt. I know I'm itching to get back out there too. I'm sure a lot of the folks watching are as well. So thank you again, and my thanks to everyone who tuned in as well. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks again, Matt.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.